Albert Einstein said, "The only thing that you absolutely have to know is the location of the library." The library is a central beacon of a community. And if you're looking for ways to get your book into the library systems, then this is an episode you'll definitely want to check out.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 99 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. This is going to be a solo show in which I share ideas and strategies for getting your book into libraries. This episode comes thanks to listener and fellow Canadian, Caro Begin, who enjoyed episode 87, where I talked about ideas on how authors could get their books into bookstores and work with local bookstores in their community. And Caro suggested that I do the same thing and would love to hear about the same thing for libraries. Now this time I'm going to be focusing on libraries and sharing strategies that work and offering ideas on ways you might be able to create and maintain a valuable relationship with your local library, as well as with libraries beyond your immediate community, which can be based on the topic or content from your book or books. But first, a word from this episode's sponsor, as well as a personal update. Did you know that Findaway Voices can get your audiobook into library systems with two different revenue models? Most authors are familiar with the one-to-one library purchasing model, where a library purchases a single copy of your audiobook and can loan it out to one library patron at a time. But many of the Findaway Voices library channels offer a cost-per-checkout business model. And this represents the biggest opportunity for self-published authors to drive library income. Because in this relationship, the library makes an enormous catalog available to their patrons and then pays out every single time an audiobook is borrowed. Gone are the traditional notions of a hold queue, and the librarians can act more like merchandisers than curators. For a patron, this makes the library feel more like Netflix. And for an author, it means you know your audience can find your audiobook in their library's catalog. Now you can learn more about how you can leverage libraries for your audiobook via Findaway Voices over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. Wanted to share a few comments recently left on the podcast. Maddie Dalrymple wrote, "Mark, that was a brilliant episode, and I have so many new ideas for how I can use my short works, including publishing an expanded version of a blog post series I did on audiobook production for the indie author as a low-price standalone offering. Thank you so much for the ideas and inspiration." Thanks, Maddie. I'm always delighted when listeners are able to adapt ideas I share into their own useful and unique strategies for their own books. That's what this is all about. So I'm so glad that you shared how that inspired you. And on the same episode, Chad Boyer said, "Nice breakdown, Mark." And then he went on to say, "I thought about the patron subscriber route in terms of having short stories or serials for patrons. However, I found out two things. One, writing a serial for the first time is not trivial. Two, you need an audience in order for Patreon to work. Patreon is not the best place to build an audience because discoverability there is non-existent. Maybe Wattpad or something similar to build an audience first and then transfer to Patreon to get some money out of it?" Thanks, Chad. Great question. And I do like your idea of a serial, so thanks for sharing that. And yeah, you do need an audience before something like that works on a site like Patreon. You have to have an audience to bring to that site, an audience that is interested in what you're providing. Now, from my own experience, I've used Wattpad in that way. In fact, my thriller Evasion was put there on Wattpad as a first draft with a note. After I finished it during NaNoWriMo, completely unedited, I put it there with a note saying, "This is an unedited version of the book. I just wanted to put it out there and see what people thought of it." And it's still my most popular book, yes, in a mostly unedited form on Wattpad. And the feedback and the comments that I got from readers on Wattpad are what prompted me to make the ebook, print book, and audiobook. Because two of the most common questions were, oh my God, where can I buy this? And again, buy it was both print and ebook. And then eventually I decided that would be the first audiobook I would create for the same reasons. And then the second question, which I haven't yet actually done anything with, was when is the sequel coming out? I had never intended on doing a sequel, but reader feedback suggested that I could continue the story. And of course, it does have a bit of an open ending. So yeah, there are many things to do there. Not that I've gotten to it, but that's another issue with my procrastination. And we're not going to go there right now. But thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Chad, for leaving comments on episode 97. If you have comments about any episode, feel free to leave them over at starkreflections.ca or just at me on Twitter. I'm at Mark Leslie on Twitter. Now, in terms of a personal update, I am very pleased to be part of a writing-related story bundle that is running right now as I record this, and will be running as this goes live on Friday, October 11th. And it'll be running for approximately another 50 days or so after you first hear this, if you are hearing it, around Friday, October 11th, 2019. It's the 2019 NaNoWriMo Writing Tools Bundle, and it was curated by my good friend Kevin J. Anderson. The bundle includes 14 books and a video course from Dean Wesley Smith. Now, I created a special exclusive 2-in-1 of the 7 Ps of Publishing Success and Killing It on Kobo, the first 2 books in my Stark Publishing Solutions series, and I did that just for this bundle. But the bundle also includes a book on author newsletters from Andrea Pearson, Kevin J. Anderson's book on dictating for writers, or dictation for writers, David Farland's Writing Wonders, one of his new books, Productivity for Authors by Joanna Penn, How to Make Money, a Freelancer Survival Guide by Christine Catherine Rush, and many other great books by Matt Buckman and Chris Fox and Jody Lynn Nye and more. And you can find this bundle over at storybundle.com/nano, N-A-N-O. For $15, you can get the entire bundle of all these books and the great course from Dean Wesley Smith. Well, that's it for the introductory notes and personal updates of this podcast. Let's jump right into the main content: you, your books, and libraries. When I was a little kid, I remember one of my very first visits to the local public library. I lived in a small town of less than 2,000 people in northern Ontario. The nearest bookstore was an hour's drive away. But my small hometown had a public library. And the public library was a truly magical place. I could go there, select a stack of books that I wanted to read, and we could bring them home. Then the next week we'd return those books and we'd get a whole new pile of new ones. It was a truly wondrous and marvelous experience for me. I imagine your local library when you were growing up might have been a similar wonderful experience for you. Obviously something got you into being interested in writing. Chances are very likely that it was reading. And chances are it was reading at an early age, and chances are the library was involved. Now, I continued that tradition of library visits with my son when he was little. Every Saturday morning, we would get up and we would head to the neighborhood library, where we'd pick a stack of books to take home that I could read to him throughout the week. Other books that he could read to himself, particularly as he got older. And I remember as he got older, that moment when he got his very own first library card. That, to me, was like passing him the power of Thor's hammer, or the majesty of Excalibur, or perhaps more accurately, showing him the doorway to countless worlds and experiences. That's what a library is. It isn't just a building filled with books. It's a dynamic part of energy that opens up the world to quench thirsty minds. As an author, there are 3 main formats of books that you can get into the library. print, ebook, and audiobook. At least for now, in 2019, those are the three main formats of books. If you're listening to this far into the future, chances are there's more. Chances are there's a lot more, because we're still only at the early days of the digital revolution of publishing and storytelling. But back to those three formats of print, ebook, and audiobook. First, you have to ensure your book is available to libraries. And then you need to ensure the library is aware of the titles, and then that they have the desire to acquire them. And that's what I call the 3 A's of library strategy. They're availability, awareness, and acquisition. I have a thing for alliteration, what can I say? But let's start with the idea of availability. And within that area, let's start with print books, because print is perhaps the most common format that we think about when we think about libraries. First, if you're traditionally published, and I mean by publisher or traditional publisher, I mean by a publisher that does offset printing rather than POD or print-on-demand printing. If you are traditionally published in that way, then that publisher likely has warehousing, has direct library sales channels, or is already set up to sell their books through Ingram or Baker & Taylor, which are two of the English language world's largest wholesalers of print books. So, if you are traditionally published with a smaller publishing house that uses POD or print-on-demand printing, then those books might still be available to libraries, most likely via Ingram, but I would advise, if you have signed the rights to a book to any publisher, that you double-check and ask your publisher where and how libraries can purchase their books. I know, for example, that the books I've published through Dundurn, a Toronto-based publisher, are available to libraries and bookstores through UTP distribution in Canada, and that they're also available in the US through Ingram. Now, for my self-published books, which are not printed through a traditional publishing house and not printed in offset printing and not stored in warehouses, they are print-on-demand titles or POD titles. They're printed on demand and they're supplied to bookstores and libraries when order or when demand is created. I know that these are available to the libraries and they're available via Ingram. Now, the best, most direct way for authors to get into Ingram's system is using Ingram Spark. Ingram Spark is an author-friendly front end to get your book into Ingram's print-on-demand catalog. You can also get the book into Ingram's catalog via other sources. So some service providers do offer library distribution as well. I know that, for example, Draft Digital Print, which is currently in beta at the time of this recording, goes through IPG, which is, they publish a lot of independent publishers in the States or distribute for them. But it goes through IPG and Ingram for global POD distribution. So if you're using some other POD service for your self-published book, check with them to see how their books are made available to libraries. Now, a note of caution here. A lot of authors use Amazon Kdp Print, and Amazon Kdp Print is free, and it's a great way to get your book into Amazon's catalog. Probably the best way to get your book into Amazon's catalog. But their extended distribution option isn't as attractive nor as appealing to libraries. Now, this is likely due to crappier terms offered to bookstores and libraries than the library would most likely get if you control that via a place like Ingram and Ingram Spark. Now, some libraries might actually be opposed to the idea that they're ordering books from Amazon. So that could actually be a thing that puts them off. I know it definitely puts off bookstores, particularly independent bookstores that are feeling the competition from Amazon. It's like saying, hey, bookstore, go and order my book from the big giant monolithic company that's trying to put me out of business. Go and order it from your worst competitor. But you can use Amazon Extended Distribution, but just be aware that you might get some pushback from libraries. So that could negatively impact both the awareness and the acquisition. So availability may be there, but awareness and acquisition might be reduced in some cases. Just be aware of that. And in that same vein, if you are using Ingram Spark to make your POD book available to libraries, The authors that I know with the most success selling into those channels have usually selected the deepest discount available, like 55%. Yeah, I know, it means a deeper hit on their margin, and sometimes it requires having to lift the retail price a little. But that larger discount to libraries and to bookstores can be appealing to the buyers at libraries and bookstores. And while bookstores are also looking for non-returnable terms, the library purchasing model isn't about returns. So you stand a much better chance of library acquisition than you do bookstore acquisition. And that's a great thing to consider when you think about the reach that libraries have into different communities. Now, let's move on to availability of ebooks. There are a number of library wholesale distributors that exist and help you get your books into the library markets. I'm not going to provide any sort of authoritative list of them because you have access to Google after all. You can use places like Smashwords, Draft2Digital, StreetLib, Kobo Writing Life, for example, to get into the various channels that serve the library markets. There are other options such as Self-E, which is Self-E, which is a joint venture from Library Journal and BiblioBoard. It's designed to expose self-published ebooks to more readers via public libraries. Distribution through Selfie, though, is royalty-free, which means authors don't earn royalties, do not get compensated through this platform. Selfie might best be seen as a marketing tool to build a readership through library channels, but for the purposes of this episode, I would much rather focus on the opportunities that allow you both exposure in the library market as well as income. Now, many of these channels serve iBooks to Overdrive, and Overdrive is perhaps the world's largest wholesaler to the library market for English language titles. So let's spend a little bit of time focusing on them. First of all, it is possible to have a direct account with Overdrive. It's difficult, but possible. And I base this on speaking with dozens of bigger name indie authors who were able to establish a direct account with Overdrive over the years. It's likely not worth your time, hassle, and struggle. The systems and the methods by which you can get titles into their systems directly are painful and extremely manual and require understanding and using FTP and Excel files and a bunch of frustration that'll remind you of the press play on tape 1 days of computing if, like me, you're of a certain age. Seriously, the people at Overdrive are among the nicest and most passionate book nerds you will ever meet. But their systems are not optimized for small publishers or indie authors communicating with their business. Their systems are optimized to serve the library community, which is their forte and why you want to be in their catalog. There's no need for Overdrive to waste time and resources building out author-friendly front end because they have no shortage of third-party companies and even sister companies that specialize in getting titles into their system. Now, speaking of sister companies, let's start with Kobo and Kobo Writing Life. So Kobo and Overdrive are sister companies, both owned by Rakuten. You may notice that the official names for the company are actually Rakuten Kobo and Rakuten Overdrive. Rakuten is a major company that originated in Japan and is a tech company. In Japan, for example, Rakuten is as well-known a brand as Amazon is known. So think about the size of something like that. Now, because of this ownership with Rakuten, and because of the months that I spent negotiating when I was running Kobo Writing Life, if you make your books available to Overdrive via Kobo Writing Life, you get the same margin that you do if you had an account directly with Overdrive. So you get all the benefit of the margin without any of the hassle of the tech stuff that you have to deal with. And that margin is 50% of the library list price. I.e., if you set a library price of $10, you would make $5 every time a library buys a single copy of one of your ebooks. And that's under what's known as either a one-to-one or a one-copy, one-user licensing model. This means that if a library system, the New York Public Library, for example, buys a copy of your ebook, they can loan it to one patron at a time forever. You get paid a decent amount upfront for the book, 50%. Now, this one copy, one user model via Kobo Writing Life, which offers you that 50%, is the highest margin that you'll make from any third-party provider to Overdrive. If you use Smashwords, That one copy, one user model would get you 45%, and via draft to digital, you get about 47%. However, with draft to digital, there is an additional model that isn't currently available via Kobo Writing Life. If you make your book available to Overdrive via draft to digital, there's also an option to opt into the CPC or cost per checkout model. Now, in the cost per checkout model, libraries are able to get access to the same title for more than one user at a time. And instead of a fixed higher margin of 45, 47, or 50% of the library list price, they actually pay 1/10 of the book's full list price each time the book is loaned out. Here's how that difference works. For a book that I have listed with a US dollar retail price of $4.99, I may have the library list price as $6.99, for example. That would mean that via Kobo Writing Life, I'd have the single option of one copy, one user, and I would make $3.49 per sale to a library market. Or I would make $3.27 via draft to digital. But in a cost per checkout model, which Kobo Writing Life doesn't currently have, I'd make 46 cents every time a patron checked that book out. Now, I would make less up front, like you would do in that one copy, one user model. But after more than 7 people checked out the book, I would start to earn more than that single sale. And in my own experience, particularly with the cost per checkout from audiobooks, those residual smaller payments can really add up. Imagine that your book is being read by a local book club. Now, some people are going to buy the print book, some are going to buy the ebook, some are going to flock to their local library. Either the library has to spend their budget on buying multiple copies, or one lucky reader will have access to it at a time. But in a cost per checkout model, 20 people could check out the book all at the exact same time, and quickly earning you far more than the single copy sold to a library. So remember that cost per checkout does come with some additional benefits and some additional long-term benefits. I am more leaning towards that long-term CPC option. And like I said, I've already seen some decent success in that realm already, particularly when it comes to audiobooks and Findaway voices. Now, there are plenty of other library distribution options available. Baker & Taylor, Biblioteca, and Hoopla are among the other options that libraries regularly use. Draft to digital can, for example, get your ebook into those markets and more, and each of them uses either a one copy per user or a cost per checkout model. And I'm aware of an additional library channel that will soon be announced at Draft to Digital that has both the one copy per user and the cost per checkout model available. So let's look at availability of audiobooks. For your audiobooks, the easiest way that I'm familiar with getting audiobooks into the library market is using Findaway Voices. Yes, they are the sponsor of this podcast, and yes, I already talked about that in the sponsorship element. But in a nutshell, with Findaway Voices, you can get your audiobook into the following library markets: Overdrive, Baker & Taylor, Biblioteca, Hoopla, Odillo, Biddy, EBSCO, Follett, MLOL, Three Leaf Group, Permabound, and Wheelers. And they all have a combination of either a la carte, like the one copy per user, or a cost per checkout model. Or in places like Overdrive, Biblioteca, and Odillo, both are available. And like in eBooks, you have the ability of creating a unique library price as opposed to the regular retail price. So you can set special prices just for the library. So now that we've looked at availability, let's look at awareness and acquisition. Now I'm going to do awareness and acquisition hand in hand because the two kind of coexist in a really nice fashion that play well off of one another. Now, librarians typically order books largely based on reviews. Getting a review into magazines like Booklist, Kirkus, Library Journal, Publishers Weekly, School Library Journal, for example, can help with this awareness. But librarians also acquire books based on customer demand as well as local interest or special collections. Now, hitting more than one of these areas can increase the likeliness of the library carrying one or more of your books, and reviews via some of these markets are either hard to break into or they can cost you hundreds of dollars, which may take a lot longer to earn back. But I want to focus first on the front lines method of reaching out to local libraries. And I'd like to suggest a strategy of starting with a library local to your town or city. And then after you do that, you can do the same thing and move on to the county or region or the state or province. And it's always best to start as local as possible, then slowly move your way out. The reason is that local interest in you as a local writer can be a point of interest for them. But don't forget to think about the location and setting of your book. Whether it's nonfiction or fiction, consider the setting. Does it take place or reference a real-world physical location where that library is located? Is one of the main characters from a particular area where that library is located? That can be a local interest element. Or maybe the library specializes in a particular genre, like kids' books in school libraries, for example, or science fiction, and the Merrill Collection branch of the Toronto Public Library, for example, specializes in Canadian science fiction and fantasy. So even if you don't live in the Toronto area, if you're a Canadian science fiction and fantasy author, making them aware of that so they can acquire the book for their collection could be a useful thing. Now, Google is, as always, your friend, but sites such as LibWeb, which is basically lib-web.org, that's lib-web.org, they can help you find local different library markets. And you might want to, when you're researching library markets, is you may want to start creating some sort of spreadsheet of library contacts so you can keep track of who you've reached out to and who these people are, so you don't have to keep going back to the website once you find them. It's simple if you just do local, but it can start to get more complex if you start reaching out to a broader range of library audiences that are beyond your local region. So you might want to have fields for things like library type, and that would be, public, academic, public school, etc. The library name, library branch, the library website URL, the contact name, and the contact title or role. And again, you may have one library where you have multiple contacts' names and titles. And so the email address for the contacts, phone number or extension for your contacts, the date you contacted, which of the contacts you reached out to, and additional notes might be when you heard back from them, if you hadn't heard back to them, if you plan on doing a follow-up, etc. You can also use overdrive.com as a way to find local libraries, which is particularly useful if you're making your books available via Overdrive. Now, it's a little trickier to get to the library's actual website, but overdrive.com does offer a handy map that can be very useful and handy for you to see libraries based on region or postal code or zip code. Now, I've made a short video that's about 10 minutes long specifically for patrons of the Stark Reflections podcast, which you can find over at patreon.com/starkreflections. And that's going to walk you patrons through an example of using Overdrive to find some of my books and also to find contacts at a local library starting off at overdrive.com. Now, basically, for listeners of the show and those of you who aren't patrons, this just kind of shows how you can find the unique URL and the Overdrive ID for any of your books or audiobooks listed on Overdrive. And it can also show you how to find the unique URL for your author landing page on Overdrive. Now, I have one for Mark Leslie, and there's another one for Mark Leslie Lefebvre, where I've written some nonfiction books on writing and publishing. And in the show notes at starkreflections.ca for episode 99, I'm going to leave some examples of using the Find a Library option to locate libraries powered by Overdrive. And I'll show those examples of the URLs so you can kind of see what they are. So when you go to overdrive.com and you type in your author name, you can pull that up and then you can see that URL, which will have your unique name or your unique ID for each of your books. Now, examples of all those things are going to appear at the show notes at starkreflections.ca for episode 99. When looking at library websites, I typically try to find three main contacts, or three types of main contacts, and they are 1, the acquisitions librarian, 2, the reference librarian, and 3, the events coordinator for the library. Now, titles and roles are going to be different at every single library, every single branch. They'll have different ways of naming these people. Larger metropolitan libraries with multiple branches may have head office folks as well as people at different branches that perform similar roles. Smaller libraries might just have a few staff members who perform all kinds of roles, like one librarian that does everything. Now, some websites, of course, don't list the names of the people in the roles. In those cases, there's often a contact us form, which you can use to reach out to the libraries. And I've done both. I've reached out directly to specific people with their names and titles and addressed them personally. But I've also used the contact form and said, hello, this is a message that I'm hoping will get to whoever's in charge of acquisitions or special events or reference librarians. Now, what's really, really important and really, really critical is I know we live in an online world, but it's really important to take some time to explore and try to understand the library that you're connecting with, particularly the local ones. Yeah, check out their website. See if they have a blog or community newsletter for events or special activity resources. Maybe they have videos. Whatever it is that the library offers or specializes is understand what it is that they're doing and giving to the community so you have a better feel for who these people are and what they're up to. It's actually important to go and visit the library, particularly a local branch. Explore it and understand what they do. Attend an event there. Often the special events coordinator or some other person involved in events might be the person introducing the guest speaker or the workshop leader. Going to the library as a writer and actually working with a reference librarian to do research for your book actually makes that librarian intimately familiar with your book while you're creating it. They have a vested interest because they've helped you. Whatever that research is that you're looking for, if you're looking to understand something about a profession, let's say your main character is a surgeon and you have no access to understand what that's like, reference librarian at your local library is a great person to connect with for that. But in a nutshell, the more familiar you are with the library, their operation, the way they do things, the more comfortable you're going to be when you reach out to them to talk about you and your book and how you and your book can actually serve the library community. And you have to think about it that way. How are you and your book serving the library community? Now, I'm going to use an example. If you reach out blind to a local library with a Dear Sirs letter that talks about why your book is great and why they should carry your book, you may not get the same reception as reaching out to a local branch where you've already attended an event and you can even comment on or compliment them on something about their library. Here's an example. Dear Sheila, I attended the Kitchener Public Library's book launch for James Allen Gardner last month, and I had an absolutely wonderful time. The event was informative and inspiring, and I particularly loved the Q&A format with James and the interviewer that made it look like James was a guest on a late-night talk show. The beautiful atrium where the event was held was the perfect venue for it. The acoustics were amazing, and I commend your staff and the signage that you made available. Those both helped make for a very pleasurable experience that night, and I look forward to attending more events like that. I wanted to let you know that I'm an author who recently moved to the region, and I have a book that I recently published which is for writers. It's available in print, ebook, and audiobook format, and the ISBNs for each format are listed below, as is a link to the book via Overdrive where you can see the ebook and the audiobook version, which I see is one of the sources that you acquire audio and ebooks for. I also offer workshops that help writers understand the business of writing and publishing, and I would love the opportunity to discuss hosting a workshop for any of your patrons who may be interested in getting started in writing or perhaps in furthering their knowledge and understanding of the business aspects of writing and publishing. Now, apart from the aforementioned book, I've written or edited more than 20 books in the past 15 years with small presses, academic presses, Dundurn, Canada's largest independent publisher, as well as indie published titles. And I've also worked in the book industry since 1992, etc., etc., etc. That's just an example of when you're talking to the library, ensuring that they know you're familiar with the library, and if you've had a good experience in any way, shape, or form with the library, whether it's the browsability of their website, whether it's some sort of curation that they've done for a book that was recommended to you, doesn't matter what it is, let them know that you appreciate what you're doing in the community. Let them know that you're a part of this community. And then also importantly, let them know what it is that you can do to help serve them as they serve the community. You're there to provide them with valuable content and resources, because that's what a library is. Library is valuable content. A library is valuable resources. Now, the acquisitions or the collections librarians are typically the ones who do the purchasing. So it makes sense to contact them when letting them know about your new or your backlist book. But you also might want to ensure that the director or the head librarian or the branch manager also knows about it too, because it never hurts to have more than one person made aware of your book. Maybe the acquisitions person doesn't like thrillers and that's the kind of book that you write, but maybe the branch librarian is a huge fan of thrillers. Same way as in contacting bookstores. It could be that one bookseller that just adores the kind of book that you write, and connecting with them can make all the difference. The same thing happens at libraries. Different librarians have different tastes and different approaches and different styles. And so being in contact with different people at the library, or even establishing relationships with them in an authentic and real way, could actually work out in your favor in the long run. Now, contacting the reference librarian can also be critical. Reference librarians are amazing folks, and they are an incredible community resource. Now, these are the folks who often oversee the main information or archives or resource or research desk at a library. They are beautiful data nerds who love collecting and gathering and storing information. They love giving out information. So them knowing about you, that you're a local author, them knowing about the subject matter expert that you are, whether it's through fiction that you've written, or you're an author who writes in a particular genre, it's likely something they're going to file away. And they may pull out for the appropriate local researcher who comes along. I have spent hours and hours with different reference librarians when researching for my nonfiction books about ghosts. For example, when I was doing research for my book Haunted Hamilton, I spent a significant amount of time at the main branch of the Hamilton Public Library, where Margaret Houghton, who was the local public library archivist at the time, tirelessly filled me with all kinds of information about local history and local ghosts. And one of the resources that she gave me access to was this wonderful file folder of newspaper clippings, historical articles, and other documents that were all related to ghosts and the paranormal and the darker aspects of Hamilton's history. And this is information that I would not have known about or had access to using any of their online systems or even any of the searchability had I not asked. It was through in-person discussions and it was through conversation that I learned about all these things. Now, Margaret, who has been described as Hamilton's most beloved chronicler of local history, was amazingly helpful. And I'm pretty sure that up until her retirement in 2016, she very likely put my book Haunted Hamilton into the hands of potential readers who came in and were looking for spookier and darker tales of the city, because that's the kind of thing that a reference librarian does. So even if the acquisitions person might not be interested in your book, or you don't get any nibbles on events or anything like that, sometimes the local archivist or the reference librarian, knowing about you, knowing about your book, may be something that they can recommend to different consumers who come in there. For example, a lot of kids will show up at the library and say, my teacher says I have to read a Canadian author, or my teacher says I have to read an author from the state of Nebraska where our school is. Can you recommend anyone? These are the people who usually have access to something like that, and they love that sort of thing. Now, the contact who oversees special events or activities in a library is also important. Again, are you able to come out and do a reading or a talk about the subject area of your book? Does anything related to your book or writing connect to a workshop or presentation that you can do at the local library? And again, it doesn't have to be specifically about the book itself. It can be about research that you did within the book. I hearken back to an author like Robert J. Sawyer, who's a science fiction writer who may have researched the World Wide Web for one of his trilogies that he put out, and the idea of the World Wide Web developing a consciousness because of all the computer connections on the web that would be the same number of connections that exist in a human brain. And so even just sharing what he learned about that, not necessarily the plot line of the book could be important. But again, Rob could also come into the Waterloo area public libraries and talk about why the book is set in Waterloo and the different things in Waterloo that are associated with it. So again, not necessarily the book itself or the content of the book, but elements related to the book that you can talk about. Making yourself and your expertise known to the events coordinator is a great way to connect with the local library, because they're always looking to fulfill a need in the local community, whether it's information, inspiration, insight, or just plain entertainment. And this is a way that you can give something or offer something that might be of value to a local library. Think of it the same way I like to think about social media. 80% give and share, 20% ask. Same thing goes for libraries. Now, one of the reasons why I like to include links to the books in Overdrive, which I talked about earlier, is because you need to be made aware of something really, really important. I think it's important for authors to be aware that, now when Smashwords, and Amazing, they were there for authors in the early days, and I love that they were there and created this amazing opportunity. They were the first major self-publishing service to get indie published titles into the library system. And they ended up flooding the Overdrive database with a bunch of inexpensive and potentially less than stellar quality 99-cent titles. And the librarians at first were delighted with the pricing, because after all, the major publishers were charging ridiculously high rates for their books. Major publishers charge upwards of $30, $40, $50, $60, $70, and $80 for a single title. But libraries could suddenly buy 10 or a dozen books from Smashwords for the price of a single hot title from a major publisher. But that went south really quickly, because the flood of indie titles came without any sort of curation, and librarians love curation. So the shitty, unedited dregs of the self-publishing world, and there are a number of them out there, they were just as prominent as the highly polished, the professionally edited, the amazing and stellar indie titles. Librarians ended up wasting their time and money on so much dreck because they were flooded with hundreds of thousands of titles. And the great titles and the crappy titles were mixed in, and there was no way to tell the difference. Or there was no easy way to tell the difference until it was too late and they had wasted their money and they'd wasted their time. And this is a case where the unwashed masses created a bad name for indie or self-published titles in the eyes of librarians, or perhaps they reaffirmed a previously held belief that librarians had about self-published titles. Well, because of this, and this is why I'm explaining the background, Overdrive ended up splitting their catalog into two. One is their main regular catalog that they use by default, and it's filled with titles from the major publishers: Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, etc. Even smaller presses like, Dundurn Press, Canada's largest independent publisher. The other catalog, the other partition of the catalog, is perhaps the equivalent of the Overdrive ghetto, and it's populated with all of the self-published titles from all the sources that pretty much include any self-publishing source. So Smashwords, Draft Digital, BookBaby, even Kobo Writing Life, coming from a sister company, despite the fact that Kobo and Overdrive are sister companies. So when a librarian looks into the Overdrive catalog for a book, they immediately go to the main database. Some don't even think to look at the secondary catalog or that ghetto of titles, particularly if they had a bad experience with it in the early days. And particularly because it's a newer thing. They now have two places to look. It'd be like you using Google to search something and then going, oh yeah, I have to go to the secondary website because the secondary website search engine doesn't include access to X, Y, or Z. So many are going to the Google, but they're not thinking to check that secondary source. That's why sending the librarian the ISBN, or even the link to the book in Overdrive's catalog that includes that Overdrive ID, can make a difference, because it shows them that your book is indeed available in the Overdrive catalog, which means if they don't at first see it, they'll know to keep looking in the secondary catalog. And yes, that secondary search might come with some preconceived bias on their part, But if your communication and your relationship with the library is professional and respectful, and if they believe that you're going to bring value to them, then they're more likely to assume your book is also professional and one of the diamonds sitting in the rough. Another way of building awareness and acquisition to libraries is leveraging your fan base and leveraging people in your community. If you have a newsletter, a website, if you have ways to communicate with fans and you're announcing your new book, bookstoread.com, for example, will show the Overdrive link, which means that people can link to their favorite retailer, but then they can also link to Overdrive and see that the book is available there. You can let your fans know they can read pretty much any one of your books that you make available through the library systems for free by asking for it at their local library. They're actually doing you a favor when they do that, because when a library receives a request from a patron, that inspires them to want to carry that book, perhaps even more so than hearing from the author themselves, because the author themselves, great, hey, I have a book, maybe somebody is interested in reading this book. I mean, unless there is a particular hook that the librarian knows is going to be of interest to their community. But when a patron of the library requests the book, the library is there to serve the patrons. The library is there to provide value to those patrons. So when a patron asks for a book, that can be important. And this is another important note for those of you who may have moved out of Kindle Unlimited and KDP Select exclusivity with Amazon, particularly if you have those really angry readers who say, wait a second, I can't stand paying money for your book. How dare you charge me money? I was able to read all your books for free because I was in Kindle Unlimited. Well, it's not really free because they're giving Amazon $15 a month, but the appearance is that they're reading it for free, or unlimited reading, all you can eat reading. A really good answer to that is letting them know that your book is still available for free to them and millions of more potential readers around the world, and that you did this because you want more people to be able to read your books for free and not have to pay a single dime, because you can get the book via the local library. And here's the link to where you can request it through your local library. That's an amazing opportunity. And yeah, I understand that libraries are paid by taxpayers, etc. So people are going to say, yeah, it's not free, I pay for the library. But basically, it is a resource that you can use on an ongoing basis and get ebooks and print books and audiobooks for free. So basically, asking those people from Kindle Unlimited who are mad at you, it might be one way of appeasing them. They're probably not going to be appeased because some people just choose to be angry and not actually want a solution. They just want to complain. But it also helps many more people who are able to read your book for free. And by asking for your book at the library where they can read it for free, they're actually helping you. So in addition, one last thought on libraries is this is something I share with Canadian audiences all the time. And it may apply to you if you're not Canadian, if you live in one of the Commonwealth countries, like if you live in the UK or you live in Australia, and that's the public lending right. Public lending right is the right of authors to receive payment for free public use of their works in libraries. And more than 30 countries around the world have public lending right programs. In some countries, payments to eligible authors are based on library lending. In other countries, payments are based on the total number of copies of each book held in libraries. In Canada, for example, payments are based on the presence of a title in public library catalogs that are consulted during an annual PLR survey. And they are looking at audiobooks, ebooks, and print books. And PLR payments are determined based on the presence of an eligible title in the collections of selected library systems. So Canada's PLR approach is to include library catalogs with large collections from all provinces, territories, and regions of Canada. And they don't take into account the number of copies found in each library or the number of times a title has been checked out, just any single instance of that book in a library. So in 2019, for example, my public lending right check that came in around late February, was large enough that it paid for my all-inclusive flight, meal, and drink plan for a trip to the Dominican Republic. So it's not chump change. And it's something that can add up and become a sizable annual source of income for you if you happen to live in one of those territories that has public lending rights. Well, that is it for episode 99 of the Stark Reflections podcast. Again, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. I hope you found that helpful and useful. Next week, for grand episode 100, I will be interviewing Mark Dawson, and we're going to talk about his incredible author journey from lawyer to traditionally published author to indie author sensation. But most importantly, I believe, is the incredible, groundbreaking print-only deal that Mark Dawson just signed with a publisher. And it's the type of deal that I've been waiting for almost 10 years to see. That's coming up next week in episode 100. This is episode 99. I am Mark Leslie Lefebvre. You are an awesome reflective. Thanks for joining me in the Stark Reflection podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, please feel free to share it with a friend that you think would find value in the content. That's your way of paying it forward and helping your friend and helping me. Again, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Thanks for listening. Until next week and episode 100, here's wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.